Molly's lecture tonight, titled The Animals Naming Eve, Naming the Animals Naming Eve, has her sharing her practice of storytelling through the use of textile, natural dye, and assemblage. In her tactically rich work, Molly creates grotesque mythologies that investigate interspecies relationships, material agency, and the irreducible difference between our animal self and the animal other. Molly received her BA from Columbia College Chicago. Then she completed her MFA from the University of North Carolina and attended the prestigious summer program at Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. Quite nice, yes. Her work has been shown at the Contemporary Art Museum of Raleigh, North Carolina, the Upland Art Museum in Chapel Hill, as well as other galleries throughout North Carolina. In Chicago, Molly's work was recently shown at Roots and Culture in a two-person show with Kristen McKinney and will be featured in a solo exhibition at Co-Prosperity in 2026. Please help me welcome Molly to the stage. Is this a good volume for everyone?
That's great.
Okay, great. Hello everybody, and thank you for coming to attend this lecture. I first wanted to kind of repeat some of the thank yous that Heather already did. Also, thank you, Heather, for that beautiful introduction. I wanted to thank Columbia for inviting me here and allowing me this opportunity to reflect on the artist that I was when I was a student in attendance at Columbia. And I also wanted to give a shout out to some of my professors that are here. Owner, Joan, and of course, Duncan. And if there are any of you guys hiding here that I didn't shout out, it's not because
Adam sends his love from London.
Okay, great. Thanks, Adam from London. And of course, Anna, too. I know she's not here tomorrow, but love her a lot. Thank you all for supporting me at such crucial times in my art career. I'm going to talk about my practice in three parts up here. First is going to be going back to my time at Columbia, kind of examining some of the things that I was thinking about at the time I was working here, and then examine how those things are a thread that kind of moves through my practice into the past couple of years and what I'm planning on working on in this sort of current moment. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Your picture of sharks is a row of just recently glued together little glass animals. Let's give ourselves time to invent a kind of blushing. Belly up in a bombed-on ocean, under a bridge, where the real sharks aim their headlights over rows of them. Just recently, glued together, little glass animals. If it weren't for these hurricanes and endless highways, we'd make their names in our soup. We'd arrange the chlorine in this teacup sea around every little boat. I wanted to begin with this series of words for a few reasons. The first reason being that I made them here, and in my intro, I mentioned how I was excited to revisit that older version of myself, the Molly who went to Columbia as an undergrad, sat where you all now sit, and, well, it was actually a different place back then, but metaphorically sat where you guys all sit and saw artists give these presentations about the holes that they were, the hole that they were, the sort of thing that they do, the practice that defined them as an artist. And that always seemed fairly confusing to me. And I hope that what I can do for some of the students in the audience tonight is complicate that understanding of what an artist presents themselves as, and to reframe that question of who am I as how am I becoming, or who am I becoming with. The second reason I wanted to start with this project was because it's a seed of something that I am becoming with at this time, and as we'll see throughout this presentation, how that sort of fits into my practice as I grew over the past decade. At the time that I was in your seats, I was a student of both visual art and poetry. The words and images that I shared with you came from my attempts to join what at the time felt like two very distinctly different animals. I did this pretty literally. I began with these simple ballpoint pen and watercolor illustrations, and I was thinking about the human-animal hybrid, or I guess if I'm being more explicit, the human-animal and animal-animal hybrid, since we humans are animals in our own right. Our combined bodies, our flesh and our viscera, are a repeated form and subject matter throughout my practice into today, and the poem that I shared with its endless violent seas and highways is a composite of poems that I wrote to go with each of these illustrations during my undergraduate time in Columbia. Each human-animal hybrid illustration had its own accompanying poem, and after documenting that illustration, likely on a crappy iPhone 4 at the time, I put that image onto my computer and opened the image as a text file, then inserting the poem into the code of the text file, which some of you may be familiar as a kind of lyrical take on the popular glitch art or data bending of the early 2010s. Once inserted into the code of the image, the original illustration was distorted, and those are the sort of crazy images that you saw to accompany the poem at the beginning of this talk. At the time, there was a really strong interest in the glitch from queer and feminist theorists as a kind of disruption in this endless data flow that now we're super familiar with, but at the time felt, well, I guess it still feels scary, but at the time it felt newly scary, I suppose. And this glitch was kind of an example of the fallibility of one single code to translate the entirety of meaning. In fact, it was only through layering, hybridizing, transforming, and in so many words, breaking the code that I arrived at the images we have here. And so, like our own animal bodies, the meaning is not in the linear, broken down distinction of where one process begins or ends, but in the assemblage of materials that, combined in their way, create a new body. Here we have not just illustration, poem, and glitch art, but the tungsten carbide ball in my ballpoint pen, the 16th century Hungarian newspaper editor who scored the patent for it, the cochineal insects ground for the red pigment in my watercolor, the indigenous folks who first used cochineal to make red dye, the cactus plants the insects live on, the iPhone 4 I documented with, the raw materials of that phone, the humans who mine those materials, the poems I wrote, the job I was working, the relationship I was keeping, the gas in the Greyhound, the poem in the text file, the glitch, and again, and again, and again. When I said I wanted to complicate the narrative of what an artist is and how we can present ourselves, this is part of what I meant. It's clear to me that the number of players in the creation of an artwork are infinitely more than one. And at the same time, what we're attempting to do is find ourselves in the work, or at least that's what I've been attempting to do. Looking back, it's a struggle that's remained persistent in my concerns with my work as long as I have been making it. Here I am, one decade apart, pictures of me finding myself in the mirrors of my work. On the left is an image of my reflection in my thesis exhibition, which I'll show you more of in a little bit. On the right is a reflection in the next undergraduate project I'd like to share with you that I made in Joan's sculpture class. Today, I work a lot with the form of narrative tapestry, and revisiting this work, I'm struck with the fact that this is quite possibly my first tapestry. The listed materials are 2 bone-in ham steaks, embroidery floss, and a mirror-backed display case. And of course, we've just established this. These materials are made of infinite other materials. Forgive me for quoting Deleuze, but Deleuze says the entire universe, there are only multiplicities of multiplicities forming one single assemblage. So the question of identity as an artist making this work becomes, where do I start and where do these materials begin? Here are some details of that work. The tufting you can see here was achieved using an embroidery stitch, a technique called pom-pom stitching, where you sort of loop the floss over and over again, and then take a scissors and cut those tiny loops to create the texture. Obviously, it took me quite some time to do this. I was very tediously pulling the string through varying densities of flesh, and these steaks were rotting and falling apart. And you can even see in some areas where I attempted to mend the flesh as it was falling off of the bone. It smelled increasingly like rancid hot dogs, and as you might imagine, my roommates really loved me for that. Here's a process photo. You can see the little loops before they're cut here, and that candle in the upper right corner, that's for the smell. The process of making this work was more important than the temporary final product, which of course had to be thrown out almost immediately. At the time, I was thinking of it as a performative sculpture. The staunch vegetarian subjects herself to prolonged gendered experience with fellow rotting animal. But in revisiting it, I see something a little bit different. Like in the Glitch project, I see the beginnings of my work attempting to understand the animal body, fiber and flesh and hybridity with other bodies, as I labored over my rotting meat, destroying it and mending it over and over again. I was creating a story that joined me to the remnants of this pig. The animal hybrid is a perpetually emergent relationship made of the infinite animal that I am, the infinite animal of the other, and the infinite animal between us. Which brings us to the beginning. I grew up Catholic, so the creation story of Adam naming the animals is super familiar to me and might be to many of you as well, but for those who haven't heard it yet, I'll run through it really quickly. Basically, God makes a man out of mud. His name is Adam, and he gets really lonely. Then God makes him some animals out of mud to have dominion over and to give names to. Our boy Adam names all the animals, but he is still lonely, so God makes him a woman out of Adam's own rib bone, and her name is Eve. In this story, it's not within reason to build meaningful constitutive relationships with the animals, rather to know them by labeling them and dominating them. In this story, Adam's loneliness becomes manageable only by relating to another who looks and behaves in nearly the same way that he does. So I'm imagining a different version, one where the trouble of understanding the self is perpetually in motion through attempting to understand the other, through storytelling over and over and over again. The animals, naming Eve, naming the animals, naming Eve. In a reality where the borders between things are illusionary, stories are what we use to define the felt edges and connections between our bodies and the bodies of others. If my 2016 ham steaks were my first tapestry, this work, which I've called interchangeably hanging chickens or grandmothers, is the second. They are gun tufted, which by now most people are probably familiar. It's a machine that does rug tufting as opposed to doing it by hand on monk's cloth, and they are held up by these pink painted butcher's hooks. They were the beginning of my research into retelling the stories of narrative tapestry, considering the gendered body and the solidarity between women and animals as objects of reproduction and consumption. When I looked back at some of the most famous historical tapestries in the Western art canon, I saw reverberations of the Adam names the animal's story. From the Devonshire hunting tapestries, to the unicorn tapestries, to the Bayeux tapestries, textile narratives have been used to justify both secular and religious dominance over other bodies, human animals and animals alike. Repeatedly throughout these narrative tapestries, violent imagery leads the viewer through grand narratives of man's conquering the natural world and one another. So I began appropriating the form more directly in my own work, arriving at my thesis exhibition titled SAP, SAP, SAP. The title refers to a biblical descriptor for blood, the representation of which you can probably see is very present throughout the show. When I noticed in the old tapestries a strong attention to the bloody details, I began researching blood ritual and its almost universal prominence in storytelling that served to construct the other. Blood is an essential part of the stories that created categorical distinctions between the bodies of men, women, plants, animals, and other people, establishing the need to control those bodies based off of their labels. The interesting thing to me was that blood or sap is actually something shared amongst many living things. And I thought maybe I could widen the trope of the bloody tapestry, unfold a story of struggling to identify the self through entanglement with the other. Here's the first panel in that series. Sometimes it's hard to tell from the images, but these tapestries are all quite large. I feel like maybe the one on the screen is a little bit larger than real life, but they're fairly big. This panel begins the story by introducing the characters of the chicken people and the pig people. As you can see, they are doing violence to one another. Here's a detail of that tapestry. All of the works in this series contain some amount of the following materials: agricultural burlap, cotton, wool, synthetic yarns, non-synthetic yarns, raw wool from a sheep in North Carolina named Merrill, Carolina red clay, plexiglass, resin, rhinestones, leftover fabric from a puppet troupe, felted wool, felting needles themselves, which are dangerous, so I always have to tell people to be careful around them, and fabric paint and a lot of hot glue. I love hot glue. It's one of my favorites. Plus, of course, the infinite processes and materials between and within those things. We've talked about that enough at the point where I don't have to do that thing where all the stuff fades on top of each other. Here's another detail. As you can see, these tapestries are pretty dense, not only with material, but with storytelling. There are a lot of little stories within the larger stories of the narrative. And that's another element that I borrowed from grand narrative tapestry traditions. I really relate to the overwhelm of information in those artworks. It kind of relates to me to the overabundance of information and unruliness of the glitch art that we talked about before. I like art that rewards slow engagement when stopping to notice one thing that's happening allows you to notice another and then another. This is the second panel in that larger story, and as you can see, the characters of the pig, the chicken, and the human continue combining to make variations of their animal hybrid bodies. Here, the violence they were inflicting on one another in the first tapestry turns inwards towards their own bodies. The pig people run panicked through the garden while the chicken people experiment with self-destruction. There are a number of explicitly religious references in this series, and here's a detail of one of the chicken people tearing at their breasts. This is in reference to the medieval Christian pelican, which is beast more like an eagle than the biological pelican with the big beak that we're all familiar with. And she was often referred to as the pelican in her piety. And her whole deal was that she would stab herself and the babies, her chicks, would drink her blood. And that's how she would sustain her progeny. And this story comes from a particularly Christian bestiary tradition. As I mentioned, my Catholic upbringing a bit earlier and my interest in blood ritual. Catholicism was my first experience with blood ritual, and seeing my family and neighbors drink the transubstantiated blood of Christ every Sunday, eventually I did it too. And those Catholic stories, Adam and his animals, yes, but also the Mother Mary and Jesus, of course, were how I formulated the edges and purposes of my body and how I knew that I was distinct from others. Later in my life, when I grew to hold different kinds of stories about power and resistance and pain and helplessness, the story of my animal body became less distinct from everything around it. As my stories changed, the purposes for endeavoring in the world changed. This panel shows the violence redirected a third time. Now the characters are reconfigured into an unruly Hydra-like animal 9 times over. And they aim their efforts at the fabric itself. Newly wild, interconnected, and vulturous, the characters are more capable of powerful collective action. They hack and tear away at the snowy landscape that keeps them bound to the wall. However, the landscape is revealed to be an animal body itself. Of course it is. It's made from the same literal fabric that they are, distinct only from the other characters by the story attempting to make sense of it. The Hydra's violent and searching for meaning, liberation, and salvation, naming its struggle. I couldn't help but wonder in this last tapestry if it's even possible. Some of you might have noticed these little guys throughout the 3 previous tapestries, and within the grand narrative, they each have their own little micro story. In this third tapestry, they're mostly doing what this guy's doing, hanging on for dear life, but sometimes they're getting eaten, sometimes they're the ones doing the hunting, sometimes they're taking a little blood shower, soaking up the violence. I call these tiny guys the little white people, and their whole deal is that they love to smile. I didn't include any little white people in the final work in my thesis, though, but I did include a mirror. This work, Three Selves in Sheep's Clothing, was created separate but related to the main narrative. I wanted to take a closer look at the hybrid animals in this story and talk a little bit more about the research that I was doing into bodily categorization. In my research, I looked into the demonization of the animal body. The two figures in my tapestry, hybrid pig and hen woman, breastfeed frogs, birds, small humans, and other fauna from their many extraneous nipples. Extra nipples, or devil's marks as they were called throughout the witch trials of the 17th century, were any blemish on a human skin that could serve as evidence of breastfeeding animal familiars. They're an example of how the stories that create a body's edges can also define its openings. The open body in these inherited stories is a dangerous thing. And while indeed they're old stories and we don't revile witches quite as much as we used to, in fact, they're pretty popular nowadays, there's still an interest in maintaining stories that close and control the categories of our bodies. We live in a world where the dominant story is still Adam naming the animals, where the blurring of lines, opening of new possibilities, is somewhat dangerous. And there's still the trouble of our human loneliness. But what happens to this loneliness when we work to connect ourselves to the world around us? My thesis show was titled Sap, not only for the sap of the explicitly animal body, but the sap of other creatures we might also call kin. The background of all of the panels that I just showed each have their own unique botanical representation. Each of the plants has a personal significance to me, but they're also plants that quote-unquote bleed in one way or another. From the orange-red sap of the bloodroot, which is the one on the left, to the bright yellow milk of the wood poppy, which is the one on the right, to the descriptively named bleeding heart from my mother's garden, to the devil's trumpet, which is a plant whose seeds can be made into a sap that is one of the world's most dangerous hallucinogenic drugs. It also blooms so beautifully at night so as to stop anyone in their tracks to look. Sharing these plants with you helps me transition into sharing my current response to human loneliness. I've started thinking more about material agency, or a non-human substance's ability to serve as an actant in storytelling and not just a passive object. Opening up my practice more intentionally to collaborators is where I'd like to take the third and final section of this talk. If stories are how we navigate the spaces between our animal bodies, and here I think it's important to say plants and other forms of energy are a part of this assemblage too. I'm thinking about experimenting with different ways of how to tell that story and who to tell that story with. Here's a photo from a natural dyes workshop I took last summer, and next to it are some samples that came from those plants. I'll show you some experiments and newer ways of making that I'm starting to explore with transformative processes like natural dyes. Whether it's directly narrative, as in my tapestries, which I believe I'll always have a fondness for making, or if it's told through the process itself, the glitch creating the story. The past year has seen me open up my storytelling to include a greater diversity of methods and collaborators. For example, on the screen are 2 assemblages I made recently. The materials are wishbones, copper, toy car paint, and organza pillows stuffed with the detritus of fuzz and trash that I occasionally sweep off my studio floor. Here's a close-up where you can really see all of the textures of the work. This bubbling crab shell-like texture of the metal is created through a chemical electrical process called electroforming. This is a really ugly little photo, but it kind of explains how it works. The thing in the middle is a sculpture that I made by gluing wishbones together and covering them in graphite paint. Then I hooked the sculpture up to the positive end of an AC power source. I'm not going to give you the best science here, but this is how I understand it. I hooked it up to the positive end of the AC power source, and then the negative end was attached to another chunk of copper. Then both objects were submerged in a mixture of copper sulfate and sulfuric acid. Over time, the flow of electricity takes the copper from the small piece and deposits it onto the object that I have painted. And once again, there are loads of more scientific ways to explain it, but I'm an artist and not a scientist. If things were different, I would have not zapped myself so many times making this thing. Regardless, I see this project and my work with natural dyes as a returning to the spirit of the glitch, to cooperating with systems outside of my control. In my thinking about the infinite assemblage and our interconnected, story-defined animal bodies, I'm seeing matter and energy more clearly as collaborators in my practice. I want to end this talk with a deep appreciation for a particular collaborator I've started thinking about over the past 2 years. On screen, you'll see the tapestry I recently showed at Roots and Culture. This work, To Shed the Great Accident of Our Mortal Selves, is a return to the tapestry form and an introduction to the cicada as a guide for the next chapter of my practice. In the spring of 2024, I was just finishing up my time at the University of North Carolina. That's where I went to grad school. If any of the grads in the audience are like, you'll know where I'm at in a couple years. During this time, my fellow students and I participated in a number of protests against the genocide happening in Gaza. We were brutalized by the police, tear-gassed and beaten, and while simultaneously a seemingly separate, miraculous natural event was occurring around us. A historical mass of cicadas, Brood 19, or the Great Southern Brood, as they were sometimes called, were emerging into the sunlight after 13 years spent living underground, and they were loud. I couldn't help but listening to their buzzing as I headed home from yet another protest. I began to try and believe in a story, a metaphor that connected my body, the cicada body, and the bodies of others sharing in this struggle. That maybe in the cicada's patience and with their knowledge of worlds underground and unknown, the cicadas were singing about their transformation so that we might learn how to transform ourselves. I'd like to end on this Donna Haraway quote that sums up this talk better than I could in these 45 minutes. And it gives me inspiration as we, like the cicadas, emerge into the light. One cannot know the other or the self, but must ask in respect for all of time who and what are emerging in relationship. And that is true for all lovers of any species. Thank you.